Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Profesor je na Atomskom institutu Tehnološkog sveučilišta u Beču i stručnjak pri Međunarodnoj agenciji za atomsku energiju. 40 godina bio je na čelu TRIGA-e, istraživačkog i jedinog funkcionalnog nuklearnog reaktora u Austriji. Smatra da je najrazumniji način da čovječanstvo osigura buduće energetske potrebe kombinacija nuklearne i energije sunca, vjetra i vode. Helmuth Boeck za Al Jazeeru govori o globalnoj potrebi za stabilnim i ekološki prihvatljivim izvorima, ponovnom interesu i investiranju u desetljećima zanemarivanu nuklearnu energiju, te pojašnjava dileme koje godinama prate njen razvoj.
Mr. Boeck, welcome to the program of Al Jazeera Balkans.
Welcome here.
Could you tell us a little bit about the place where we are, the Atom Institute in Vienna?
Atom Institute Vienna has been founded in 1959 and was officially opened in 1962, only 3 years of construction. It is, at that time, there were 3 research reactors in our country. 2 of them have been closed down, and we are the only remaining reactor for education and training belonging to the Technical University of Vienna. And we train students, both national students and foreign students, in areas like nuclear technology, radiation protection, application of radioisotopes and other subjects like this. In addition, we have a large group of quantum physics which do not use the reactor, but who are also located in our institute.
For the first time in the history of humankind, at the end of 2022, scientists in the US achieved a landmark in nuclear fusion. More energy was generated than was invested. Could you tell us about the importance of this breakthrough, but also explain for the audience the terms of nuclear fusion and nuclear fission?
Let's go to your last question. The heavy nuclei, like uranium, are very unstable, and if you excite them by irradiation with a neutron, for instance, then they start to vibrate and split into 2 smaller particles at the same time. A large amount of energy is released. And if you control this in a nuclear reactor, you can produce very high thermal energy, which can be converted into electricity. These are the nuclear power plants, which are presently about 440 such nuclear power plants are operating worldwide. The nuclear fusion is just the opposite procedure, where light nuclei like hydrogen or deuterium are pushed together through very high temperature, several million degrees, and they fuse together, and during this fusion also some energy is produced, which will be the central point of so-called fusion reactors. However, fusion reactors have been developed since about 40 or 50 years, and the largest project is now in France, in Cadarache, where the ITER, this is the brand name of this reactor, should be operational within this decade. But this is only a demonstration plant, it's not a commercial plant. While nuclear power plants are fully commercial, they produce electricity, feed the electricity network, and we all benefit from secure electricity supply.
Can we just go back in the beginning? I asked you about the breakthrough, about the research that was done in December in the United States.
Yes, this was the first sustaining fusion reaction which demonstrated that fusion can be realized. However, we are in the fusion development very similar like in the fission development in the early 50s. So it's just, I mentioned, the prototype demonstration plant. In order to use this fusion energy commercially on a high level, it may need again, I say, 30 to 50 years to have an operational commercial fusion reactor.
Is nuclear energy more reliable or perhaps the most reliable energy source on Earth?
Yes, we have different energy sources, of course, available, which is fossil fuel, like coal gas. We have renewable, like hydro, solar and wind. And in the last 50 years, something like we have nuclear power plants. Now, nuclear power plants are so-called base load energy sources, electricity sources, which produce electricity throughout the year on a constant level, similar like hydro. Wind and solar depends on the conditions. If you have sun or wind, it usually produces electricity 20% of the year. What's about the other 80%? This must be compensated by other energy sources, which are, again, fossil or nuclear. Fossil are, in the last 10 years, there is a large doubt about fossil fuel because of carbon dioxide production. So if we stop the fossil-fired plants, there's nothing more left than nuclear. And of course, there are objections from many sides against nuclear because of accidents which happened in the past, like 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, or Fukushima, but also about some nuclear waste which is produced. But compared to fossil power plants, nuclear waste is highly concentrated in the nuclear fuel and can be handled safely and stored properly, while fossil plants release their carbon dioxide in the environment, and it is distributed all over the world and may lead to temperature increase on the globe or melting down of the poles and things like this. So it's a delicate balance, and there are new developments in nuclear, so that the future of nuclear power plants is quite positive nowadays.
And can you tell me about the democratic, let's call it like that, democratic potential of nuclear energy in terms of its accessibility to all?
In many countries, there is still a lot of objection against nuclear power. Take, for instance, Austria. Austria built a nuclear power plant for several billion of euros, and just a few months before it was planned to start up, public opposition increased, and our chancellor at that time, Bruno Kreisky, he decided to make a public referendum on nuclear power, which was slightly on the negative side, against nuclear. So this nuclear power plant, also it was almost finished, was closed down, work stopped. It's still there without fuel. The fuel has been returned to the supplier, and it's considered as a nuclear museum where you can see nuclear installations without background radiation, and you can book a guided tour through this center. But this is not the only country where nuclear opposition is quite strong. Another country is Germany. Germany was the leading nuclear country in the 70s and 80s. And after Fukushima, Angela Merkel decided to phase out nuclear power in Germany. So they started to close down every year 1 or 2 nuclear power plants until last summer, when the Ukrainian crisis started and the gas supply was under question from Russia, and 3 nuclear power plants were still in operation. They should have been closed down in December last year, but to be sure to go over the cold winter period, they decided to extend the lifetime of these 3 nuclear power plants. And they will be closed probably in April.
So definitely still they will close them regardless of all the changes made.
It looks like. But then Germany decided to build more new coal-fired plants, which is again in the center of objection of the green parties and green supporters, because you produce a lot of carbon dioxide.
But it was also one of the arguments for the green agenda against the use of fossil fuels.
Right.
And now we have the green agenda of the European Union. Now we have the plans, especially led by France, to reintroduce and to build new mini reactors and to go back to nuclear energy. How much damage was done with in the last few decades after the stops in the development?
Well, especially in Germany, as I mentioned, leading nuclear country in the 80s, the competence was completely lost in nuclear. My contacts to German universities show that there are practically no students anymore available in the nuclear area. No real nuclear industries available in Germany. Everything has been lost. Certain cases have been outsourced. For instance, as an example, Germany developed a high-temperature helium-cooled reactor in the 80s, and when the anti-nuclear period started and everything, the competence of this high-temperature reactor was first sold to South Africa, but also South Africa transferred it to China. Now China is the leading country in future high-temperature reactors, and Germany depends on the coal-fired plant and on nuclear imports from neighborhood countries like France, like Czech Republic, and of course they want to expand their wind power in a large scale in Germany.
Could wide-range implementation of nuclear energy fulfill the green agendas set out by the European Union?
Nuclear is a good partner actually for wind and solar. There are a lot of possibilities for solar and wind parks along the shore of Atlantic coast and North Sea coast, and of course they produce energy during the wind period, and in the off-wind period, nuclear could continue to deliver electricity on a very safe level as it is required from industry and from the population. So, however, to completely replace other, let's say, fossil fuel plants in Europe and to replace it by nuclear, it will take maybe 50 or more years to construct nuclear power plants, because the technology in the industry is not available to build nuclear power plants on a series it takes about 10 years to build a nuclear power plant, and Europe may need 50 to 60 additional nuclear power plants to compensate.
And these are all the years that were lost after the
Yes,
shutdowns.
yes, everything has been lost. But may I also mention that besides those large nuclear power plants like France is producing or is planning, there is a new development which are called small nuclear power plants, which are in the small power level like 300 megawatt or so compared to 1500 megawatt. And they can be built on a faster scale within about 3 years in a modular type. Already China again is placing a lot of efforts on small modular plants, and that could be also a possibility to solve the problem of the large nuclear power plants, which needs a lot of money and a long time to be built.
Is there a possibility for zero emission of dangerous substances?
Fusion is also based on nuclear reactions, and also fusion reactors do not contain uranium or plutonium. It produces and needs during its operation period, it produces radioactive materials like tritium. Tritium is a very, very serious hydrogen gas, actually, with a beta radioactive gas, which is dangerous for persons, for the mankind, because it can be absorbed in the human body and can there create radiation damage in the cells. So you must be really, it must be operated very carefully to not to release tritium to the environment. In addition, materials used in the fusion reactor are activated and produce radioactive waste, actually, radioactive niobium and vanadium. So the radioactive production is more or less in the same range like nuclear fission.
And you mentioned earlier, you mentioned Chernobyl and you mentioned Fukushima.
Yeah.
Especially for our audience, what are in the possibility of further development of nuclear energy, building new nuclear reactors and plants? What can you tell us about the dangers of those scenarios repeating, and is there a possibility to prevent them?
The nuclear power reactors have undergone more or less 4 generations since the origin in the 52. Generation 1 was the prototype type, very small reactors, they are all closed down. Generation 2 was built in the 60s and 70s, and many of them are still operating, for instance in France or in the United States. Generation 3 was the next group from the late 80s, 90s, still operating, and now new reactors, generation 3 plus, with additional safety features are on the market, they are under construction. And these generation 3 plus reactors have several additional safety features which we can assume that these reactors can be called ultra safe. They have double containment, so no release to outside, even in accident condition, no impact from outside, like airplane or tsunami or so. They have a core catcher, which means when the core really melts, what should never happen, it is caught in a ceramic basin and solidifies there without effect to the environment. So this generation 3 plus are now started just in Finland, the APR reactor from Framatome or Areva, and in China, a couple of these generation 3 plus have been put in operation, under construction, and in Hinkley Point in Great Britain, and there is an interest in the European countries on these 3 plus reactors, all with a power level of about 1,500, 1,600 megawatt electric. And in addition, the small modular reactors, of course, they have all very further developed safety features that it is not expected to have anything similar to Chernobyl or Fukushima.
I see. Where do you see further development of nuclear energy in long term, let's say in 100 years?
I assume that small modular reactors will have a high fraction in various countries. Many countries, additional countries, will have nuclear power plants like Europe, Poland, Turkey. They are ready for new reactors, but outside Europe, also Africa. 6 countries in Africa are interested in nuclear power. And Asia, of course, is the booming area. Also Japan building further reactors, even after Fukushima. So the future would be a mix of small modular reactors, generation 3 plus reactors, wind and solar energy, and of course hydro always, and hopefully fusion reactors. So that will be reactors based on nuclear and reactors based on environmental renewable energy sources.
Could you tell us, you told me before the interview that you started working here in the 60s and in the 70s.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that experience, especially because it was the beginning of the development in nuclear energy, but it was also the time of the Cold War. So maybe to look at it from today's perspective.
Well, in the early 60s, I started here in 64 and continued ever since this time. But in the early 60s, of course, you mentioned it was the Cold War, but this was more or less undercover. The general public accepted that nuclear weapons exist, but they relied on the seriosity of the politicians and so on. However, in 1962, as you may know, the world was just at the brink of a nuclear war when the Cuba crisis happened with Khrushchev and Kennedy, which ultimately were reasonable enough to stop the escalation. The general public and me as a young student at this time were mainly interested in nuclear energy and, of course, in space research. Space research was one very interesting subject for young scientists, and of course nuclear. So I started here at this institute, which was just founded in operational in 62. And we had a lot of students during this period in various areas. Some of them are almost retired now, some of my students.
We know that today in space research it's been privatized
Yes.
on a large scale. In nuclear research, can we also talk about privatization? Are there cases of this?
At the moment, not, because actually there are only 5 or 6 companies offering nuclear power plants on the world market. It's US, Russia, France, Korea, China. These are the main countries which have the capacity and the financial background for nuclear power plants. And one risk which exists for private investment is some interference to the project from the government because of objections from the population or so, which prevents to finalize the project or which delays the project over a very long period, which makes the project triple costs, for instance. Take the example of Finland. They signed the contract in 2002. The reactor was planned to be operational in 2012, 10 years, and it started up last year. So 10 years delay, and you can imagine that this has a terrible impact on the costs of the project. So I would say for the next 30 years or something, or 50 years, privatization is very risky, and I think you always need some government support.
I see. Mr. Boeck, thank you for the interview, and thank you very much for hosting us at the only operating nuclear reactor in Austria.
Thank you very much. Thank you.